So thank you so much for the kind introduction, for also inviting me to the seminar. Um, I need to start with a short disclaimer. Firstly, the lecture will be slightly different from my abstract. So instead of focusing on two bigger biographies, I'll give you many shorter biographical examples. I thought that firstly, that would be more interesting for you, but also it will help me to illustrate my point a bit better. And secondly, I also want to clarify the terminology I'm going to use, or actually, in a way, not use. I'm not really going to talk about trauma because without medical diagnosis, I cannot possibly say who was traumatized and who wasn't. So I'm going to talk more broadly about difficult experiences, not trauma per se. Um, Also, my lecture will be a bit different because I'll be discussing Magdalene Asylums in 19th-century Scotland. The Scottish asylums at the time, I argue, were places of genuine help, even though they had serious shortcomings, and obviously they were certainly not the best solutions to destitution and sexual exploitation. It is also undeniable that, like within any type of organization, there were examples of malpractice. The asylums were debated and criticized by the contemporaries, but by far and large, I argue that they were sort of imperfect prototypes of what we might call shelters for vulnerable population. Um, so I want to look at how Magdalene asylums had the power to help already traumatized or simply vulnerable women. Mm, I've divided my talk into three sections. The first two will be mainly description of the Scottish context. To some extent, I want to apologize for quite a slow beginning and not really exploring our theme straight away. But Scotland was so different from Ireland that I want to be very clear what Magdalene asylums here were, mm, because I think that otherwise you might easily misunderstand me. So the first part will be very much just descriptive to give you an idea of Scottish asylums, of the Scottish Magdalene Asylum geography, numbers, and so on. Then I'll present different types of asylums that existed in Scotland. The asylums were far from uniform, and this is really important to emphasize that no one institution was the same, and so women's experiences really differed very widely. And then I will end with biographical examples from Scottish Magdalenism. Um, Through these examples, I'll explore how the asylums provided space to deal with trauma rather than inflicting it or exasperating it. Okay, right. So in Scotland, there were around 25 asylums founded in the period between 1797 and 1914. The first asylum was opened in 1797 in Edinburgh. It was the third such institution in Britain and Ireland, as far as we know. The first decades in Scotland were pretty quiet. Glasgow Magdalene Asylum opened in 1815, and then nothing really happened for a while. It was only in 1839 that the cost picked up, and from the 1840s through to the mid 1860s, 13 new asylums were founded throughout the country. In consequent decades, this development significantly slowed down, um, while still new asylums continued to be founded. Many started struggling financially, and eventually, by the beginning of the 20th century, the Magdalene cause really lost its prominence to make space for other causes. In terms of geographical distribution, asylums were congregated in urban areas, as you can see, and specifically in the central belt and then east coast of Scotland. For many asylums, we don't really have their closing dates, so it's difficult to say how many asylums existed simultaneously in the same location, but I'll just give you rough numbers of asylums in each city. So up until 1900, Edinburgh had at least 13 asylums. Aberdeen and Dundee had 3 each. Then Greenock, Perth, and Paisley had 1 each. In Glasgow, I identified only 4, but I'm sure that if there was more research put into it, we would find many, many more smaller asylums as well. As to the religious affiliations, Scotland was obviously very different from Ireland. It was a Protestant country, and that was reflected among the Magdalene Asylums. Most of them were non-denominational with Protestant ethos. Most asylums were also founded by individuals with deep Christian faith, so asylums were not run by specific church. But I'll get to exceptions in a second. The founders and more broadly managers of the asylums often belonged to different Protestant denominations. The ministers who were invited to preach and also sometimes sat on committees also came from different churches. So it seems that there was a spirit of collaboration, and the doctrinal and political differences that normally divided congregations were put aside when it came to charity work. The attitudes towards Catholics were a little bit different, and it's fair to assume that there was a prejudice against them, but I also think that these attitudes fluctuated, and sometimes asylums explicitly welcomed Catholic applicants, and sometimes they didn't. And maybe because of that tension, the Catholic Church later founded a few of their own asylums outside of Edinburgh and Glasgow. Apart from that, there were also asylums that were run in collaboration with the Episcopal Church. For example, in Edinburgh, there was one set up by the Anglican Sisters. You have the picture over there. The Salvation Army also had its presence in the rescue movement. However, the army's residential institutions tended to combine multiple causes, so they were not really these straightforward Magdalene asylums. And I think something that is important to emphasize is that these denominational differences created a very distinct environment and Magdalene culture in Scotland in comparison to Ireland. While Catholicism values consecrated life and forms of isolation from society, Protestantism, with few exceptions like the Anglican Sisters, doesn't really share that sentiment that much. So that means that none of the Protestant asylums wanted women to stay with them too long. The goal was to train them and facilitate their return to society. Depending on the asylum, women were supposed to stay there for a few days, weeks, months, 1 year, 2 years. And women overstayed the prescribed period really in exceptional cases. As, for example, the asylum couldn't really find a job for them, and the woman just didn't have anywhere to go. Or the asylum struggled to reunite her with her friends or family. And yeah, the only exception were really the Anglican sisters who had a slightly mixed policy. But yeah, so this is all very interesting, right? And I give you the broad picture. But at this point, I haven't really interacted at all with the question of women's experiences. So I'm going to slowly move into that direction. So, what I consider crucial for understanding Scottish Magdalene asylums is that there were several different types of asylums. Um, if we try to understand what life was like in these institutions or who lived there, we shouldn't make generalizations. I suggest a classification that includes 3 types: institutions, homes, and short-term shelters. Depending on which type of asylum a woman attended, she would have a very, very different experience. So let's start with what I call institutions. To put it in simplest terms, institutions were what we usually associate with Magdalene asylums. So they were an organized, rule-bound establishment, publicly presented as institutional space with a clear moral and religious purpose. A key feature was governance. These places tended to have a sizable layered management structures, committees and subcommittees, office holders with defined responsibilities, and often also public-facing leadership to design to signal respectability and authority. That organizational scale mattered because it produced a particular institutional culture, one shaped by rules, procedures, and documentation. The same applied to admissions. They were rarely casual. Women were typically assessed through interviews and then often required to pass through a probationary stage before being fully received. And the point was not to simply establish need, but also to judge suitability. In practice, that meant that there were formal criteria and a strong emphasis on moral evaluation. Institutions often distinguished poverty or crisis from what they framed as moral fall, and they looked for signs of remorse and willingness to submit to reform. So it wasn't enough for a woman to show up and say, hey, I'm struggling. Can I stay with you for a bit? The institution's publications reflect this self-understanding. Rather than presenting the asylum primarily as shelter or training, they frequently use the language of sin, penitence, and conversion, and they describe their residents in explicitly moral terms. So often as fallen women in need of spiritual rescue. Another element is that institutions also aimed to operate at scale. Many sought to expand their capacity and to take in a substantial number of women. And by the late 19th century, some housed large resident populations. The largest ones were even, 100 women. So obviously that means that the matron didn't know everyone very well, and even the women didn't know each other very well. One influential example is Edinburgh Magdalene Asylum. It reflected this model, especially in the 1840s when it went through a period of particularly severe regime. It described itself at the time not merely as a refuge, but as a penitentiary. Its stated goal was not only to relieve hardship and instill habits of work, but to bring sinners to repentance and faith. So, in other words, the institution positioned itself as a setting where reform was meant to be both practical and spiritual, work alongside religious transformation. However, something that I really want to clarify is that in this context, penitence has a theological meaning, not a secular one. The theological penitence is about repentance, acknowledging your sins, and wanting to do better, seeking forgiveness from God. And so we all need to be penitent. We've all sinned in some way. In secular language, it came to mean to be associated with maybe with punishment. And I think maybe it's because it's mixed with the more Catholic teaching of penitence, which is a teaching of penance, which is a sacramental action where you express your penitence, the remorse, through prayers and fasting. The Calvinist understanding is slightly different, and penance, the action, isn't part of the sacramental economy. So definitely based on my research, I think that most of these asylums said that they were not there to punish, They acknowledge that many of these women were victims of poverty, of sexual exploitation. And yes, they sinned, there needs to be remorse, but it's not about punishment. Mm, and then another important element is that the daily life at institutions involved quite a controlled environment. Contact with the outside world was limited, was regulated, movement was supervised, behavior was monitored, um, and even when practices varied, the underlying principle was quite consistent. Um, Separation from the previous milieu, partly for women's safety, but not just for that, and a structured routine intended to reshape conduct, belief, and identity. So, generally speaking, such rigid institution created a less conducive space for mental recovery, obviously. Um, as I mentioned, Edinburgh Magdalene Asylum went through this particularly severe regime in the 1840s, and sometimes during the decades, it even resorted to shaving women's hair when they entered the asylum. That was partly a hygienic decision to stop the spread of lice, but it was also adopted to discourage women from leaving the asylum when they were there on a trial period, and they were just adjusting to the life there. But this was heavily criticized by the contemporaries and later abandoned. And then there were homes. Um, Homes were Magdalene asylums that defined themselves really by what they were not. The founders and supporters often described them in opposition to institutions, and this tells us what sort of atmosphere they were looking for. Um, they showed a preference for small scale intimacy and for more relational approach. So, for example, in 1873, one of Dundee's Magdalen homes in Peyton's Lane appointed a new matron, and it said plainly in a newspaper article that the new matron's aim was to make the place, I quote, more of a home and reformatory and less of a penitentiary, because the previous matron failed at that aim and the home became basically too unpleasant. Another example is Edinburgh-based philanthropist Miss Harriet Maitland, here in the photo, who founded her first asylum as an alternative to what she described as prison-like institutions, and she definitely referred to Edinburgh Magdalene Asylum. In this self-description, home was shorthand for kindness, welcome, individual attention, definitely lack of rigid rules inside the home and in regard to admission processes. Whether it worked or not, that's obviously very difficult to assess. Um, but that I think it shows us that the homes understood the importance of women's environment. This is why many of these homes were small. Often they had only around 10 women. So you can imagine that there was an intimate community. Women knew each other. The matron had time to speak to each woman as well. So that was very, very different from an institution where you had 30, 70, 100 people. Homes also adopted different rhetoric from institutions. I didn't really come across homes calling women fallen or emphasizing that they had sinned. They saw themselves, they saw them, the women, as vulnerable, harmed, and pushed into crisis. It was often said that they were more sinned against than sinners. However, this doesn't mean that they rejected the idea of moral change. So they simply resisted a style of reform that was overly systematized, too bureaucratic, too rule-bound, too impersonal. What the home model questioned was not the spiritual aim, but the method. It argued that supporting these women can be best achieved through a smaller household setting, where influence is exercised through daily relationships, not heavy-handed discipline. So I'll give you an example of relationships that could form in such institutions. Miss Harriet Maitland founded and co-founded lots of Magdalene Asylums in Edinburgh and Dundee. She was most closely associated with her first home that she set up in Corstorphine, which is at that time near Edinburgh. Originally, it was for former prisoners who had a need for shelter and to start from scratch, but the home actually became so popular that it took lots of different cases. And also Miss Maitland expanded her charity to schools for preschool age children. In 1866, the home had 13 women. In that year, Miss Maitland reported 2 cases of former inmates who asked her to come when they were in hospital or dying, showing that a level of personal relationship developed between them. And you might mistrust such report because it was reported by her, but she was actually known for running her charities differently. She lived next to the asylum. She was criticized by other charity workers as being too lenient, accepting just anyone, not for her residents not working hard enough. She in turn criticized the police for closing the brothels and not really thinking through the consequences it would have on the women there. And eventually she died bankrupt because, most likely because she spent all her wealth on her charities. So this really makes me think that her account is accurate. And then the last category is very easy to define. These are short-term shelters. They weren't designed for women to complete a full, long reformation program. Instead, they offered much shorter stays, and they could be divided into further 2-3 categories. So the first subtype is the temporary shelter, which offered immediate relief. So these were places where women, usually seen as destitute and perhaps fallen, could arrive at a short notice for food and bed. They were typically small and had a high turnover. For example, an asylum called The Rescue in Edinburgh sheltered women who wanted an immediate escape from prostitution, sometimes after experiencing religious conversion. Policies of that asylum shifted over time, but at one stage, the shelter offered only a few days of rest, at most 3 weeks. It had a capacity of 10 women. Some women returned to families, some were directed to medical help, others entered other institutions, some also returned to their previous lives. And actually managers often complained about the last group. But the key point is that these places provided relief without formally binding conditions. Another type was a halfway house. They did more than providing just a bed, but they still didn't really impose a set program. The aim was to give women time to rest, reflect, and consider next steps. This could be applying for a longer term Magdalene Asylum, but it could also be an attempt to reconnect with their families or any support network. Springwell Rescue Home for Young Women in Edinburgh had a capacity of 12 women, so it was still quite small. But actually, very often they had fewer women there. So this category also included probationary houses where women were assessed before properly joining a Magdalene Asylum. But just I should mention that this shouldn't be confused with the probation in legal sense. So in Glasgow, the probationary home was attached to the Magdalene institution, and it became quite substantial. It accommodated up to 50 women by the early 20th century. So just to remind us, the point is that women had very, very different experiences based on where they applied. I should also point out that the system wasn't centralized in any way. So some women entered one asylum, they stayed there for a few weeks, months. They left, they joined another one. Sometimes they used these asylums seasonally when it was very cold in the winter or when there was just no work. But there wasn't enough coordination among the asylums to identify those women who, as the philanthropists perceived it, took advantage of the charities. Right. So what does it mean in practice? Um, I'm going to start with an example of Georgina Courtney, who stayed in a few asylums in England and Scotland. In 1886, she was a resident of a Dundee asylum in Payton's Lane. It was also called the Home. Um, and in that year, she wrote a poem that was published in a local magazine. So you can see it on the side. She just to quickly summarize it, she describes how women like her used to have a good life. She worked 12 hours per day, but she had a feeling of doing the right thing. She had fair earnings. Um, and it was only the pride and vanity that led them to sin. And then she goes on describing how women start drinking heavily to quench their consciousness. They realize what they've lost and they miss the family home. So at first glance, you think that's just Magdalene propaganda. That was my first impression when I read it. Um, the narrative is quite simplistic, apart from one bit when she discusses double standards towards men and women, which is interesting. But otherwise, it doesn't sound very genuine. The poem doesn't mention the obvious social problems like economic inequalities, poverty cycles, and so on. However, what's interesting, if you actually look at Georgina's biography, it turns out that the poem does reflect her experience. So Georgina was born in Dundee. She was a highly talented singer and performer. There are newspaper records of her performing at increasingly popular weekly events at halls in Dundee, and the picture in the background is actually one of those concert halls. I don't think it exists anymore, and she got really good reviews. But then, when she was 17, her mother died, and this marked a turn in Georgina's life. According to her, this started her fall, partly shaped by her father's example and her fun-loving disposition. She married around the time, but her husband died suddenly. She remarried 2 years later, and she reported that it could have been a happy marriage, but for her drunkenness. She left her husband for 9 months. We don't know what she did during that time. And then when she returned, she caught him with another actress. She threw a bottle at him. She harmed him so badly that actually she was worried about prosecution and going to prison. So she fled to Germany and she worked as a weaver in Germany. Um, I'm not going to go into details, but basically she traveled a bit, and then once back in Britain, she was repeatedly convicted for theft, for inebriety, disorderly behavior. There was a clear pattern of her trying to build her life anew and trying also to overcome her alcoholism. And what's important is that she sought help in Magdalene Asylums many times. To pick just one example, she went to Edinburgh Magdalene Asylum, which was the biggest institution in the city. Afterwards, she managed to secure a job as a servant, but one day she got drunk. Presumably, she was dismissed and she returned to the asylum. Eventually, someone recommended to her that she goes to the Salvation Army rescue home in Edinburgh. She stayed there just for a few months, interestingly. Then she got a job. She eventually moved to Glasgow, first to work as a weaver, then as a general servant, and also she remarried for the third time as well. But throughout her life, she continued to be imprisoned, to have these ups and downs that happened in Dundee, in Aberdeen. So clearly she continued to move around. And then she tragically died in 1902, reportedly because she fell down the stairs when being drunk. So this story shows us that how different types of Magdalene asylums, in her case, both homes and institutions, could be places of shelter, a place where women tried to reset. Georgina used to use them to fight against her alcoholism, and they assisted her with finding a job. The Salvation Army home also provided her with a temporary accommodation while she was just starting a new job. So she actually left formally the rescue home, but they allowed her to stay on a bit while she was starting this new job, presumably because she didn't have enough money to pay for other lodging at that point. Edinburgh Magdalene Asylum was there for her to return after her drinking incident. I imagine that otherwise she would be homeless. But these places didn't only offer practical help. In the Dundee home, Georgina actually had an opportunity to perform for the community, and apparently visitors could also enjoy her singing. I don't know the details, but I think that it is plausible to imagine that being able to live in safety and then experience making art again was in some way therapeutic. Or, I mean, at least it was just a break from this constant cycle of drinking, struggle, and unemployment. Another example, much shorter, is of Isabella Drummond, who was determined to change her life. She was a widow who had 4 children, 2 with her husband and 2 with another man. She has been in prison and a workhouse, and while she was in a hospital in Arbroath, which is not too far away from Dundee, she apparently requested that she joins not yet opened Magdalene home in Dundee. And the hospital agreed. They actually agreed to keep her a bit longer so she could stay there until the home was opened. And so she became the first resident there. What's interesting is that the matron noted in her diary that, I quote, "I don't think there is any sorrowful sin committed against God except for the suffering it has brought her." So we see here that Drummond's motivation behind going to the asylum was improving her lot. She had children outside of wedlock. It seems that she didn't really feel bad about it. And the asylum was well aware of that and fine with that, to some extent at least. On the first Sunday of her being there, she shared her life story with the matron, including her suicide attempt. And this is just one of many examples from this diary when the matron engaged in really personal and difficult conversation with a woman for whom I would say she clearly cared. A bit later on, Drummond was concerned that she'd never see her children again. So at first, the matron prayed with her about it, but the asylum also took practical steps. So one of the managers visited her children and then came back to report to Isabella that they were doing well. And then not long before Drummond left the asylum, the matron arranged a trip to Arbroath so she could see one of her children there. I think this is an excellent example how the Magdalene asylums could provide a degree of emotional support and almost you could say counseling. But apart from giving examples of individual women, I also wanted to share examples of, or an example of how an institution might have helped women with by adopting a more open model. So in Aberdeen, there was this institution called or institution, asylum, called penitentiary, but it wasn't really what the name suggested. It was a very pragmatic asylum that I really struggled to classify whether it was a home or institution or something completely different. And perhaps not throughout its existence, but definitely for the period for which we have the documentation. So 1851, 52, the asylum was more of a base for women. So, for example, during the harvest season, the residents would go in groups to a local fishing market where they would look for a seasonal employment. Here, an example I have is of Jean, who did exactly that. So she was Irish, she was 29 at the time, unmarried with a daughter, who didn't stay at the asylum. Jean traveled, so Jean managed to secure a job, and she traveled with another woman from the penitentiary to Edinburgh area, but she got ill on the way to harvesting, and she wasn't allowed any time to recover by the employer, so she just couldn't work. Uh, and her friend, for her friend, the work was too heavy, so again, she she didn't work. So they returned to the penitentiary. Mm, and this shows that the asylum acted as a safety net to which women could return when their jobs failed through. In the same year, Jean was allowed to leave the penitentiary to try to find a place for her daughter at an industrial school. So here we have an example when the asylum's um, prime aim is obviously to support the woman, but they recognize her needs and responsibilities towards her family. This particular asylum didn't cut women off from the outside world, but it seems that it tried to respond to women's needs, whatever they were. This was definitely an exception, but I think it's just important to mention that such model existed. And yeah, basically these are all examples I had and I wanted to share with them. So I just wanted to conclude um, that 19th century Scottish Magdalene asylums were diverse, they were uneven, often flawed, but they were definitely not uniformly sites of harm because they range from these large rule-bound institutions to small homes and short-term shelters. Women's experience varied widely. In many cases, difficult experiences predated admission, and the asylum functioned as a safety net, offering food, shelter, work pathways, and sometimes also sustained personal care. And I think these stories of Georgina, of Isabella, Jean, and the charity of Miss Harriet Maitland shows that. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to all the questions.